Okay, so once you've got all of your kind of sculpting done and modeling and your edges have been realigned and all that stuff, you actually need to we need to remap the UV normals or the UV map. So if I select it and open up my UV, oh, not that one, UV editor, you'll see, right, that so it reverts back to the original, meaning that there's some other pieces that have been laid out like this because we changed the geometry a bit. So all we need to do is do the same thing. We go back into plan view and planar project, same setting. And now we're all good. And the next thing is just to visualize it. So I've got my image on here. And let's turn off wireframe. So you can see it does a pretty good job. And also what you're noticing is I've added a bump map. So it gets all the kind of micro crenellations. This is more just to visualize it. So this way, in terms of rendering, hopefully with that bump map, the black and white image, you'll be able to get this kind of quality of articulation without all the geometry. So this should help in being able to bring this into Unity and basically just move across platforms with a smaller file size and object. And so in Maya, if you don't know how to do this, let's open up the Hypershade. And so you can see here that on my original shader, this has been added. And so this is just a surface, there's 2D texture file. So that's what this is. And then to add this, you come to Utilities and Bump 2D. So those get connected there, and then the out normal goes into the normal camera. And then you can adjust the bump depth here. So basically that's all you really need to adjust. And so you'll see that you can't see my hypershade now, but you can see what happens when I slide that one way or the other. So this is going in, which is the wrong direction. Should be coming out. About so. Okay. So that should basically, let's kind of finalizes this step a bit in terms of getting this articulated. But so hopefully these techniques, and primarily the modeling techniques, because you're going to be bringing this surface kind of back and forth between Maya and Rhino. Less Blender now. But I think, let's say, now that this is ready, I would export it as OBJ again, bring it back into Rhino, put it back into my model, and depending on what gets set up, at some point we're going to start to cut into this thing to make connections, either circulation or add things, basically like paths and places to occupy. So it's almost like treating this as a kind of, through a surface as a chunk of Earth that we would perform some kind of geoengineering operation on it. So this is now prepped to be able to model it and transform it that way. Okay, so I'm going to export this now, and just a couple of things to remember. Remember that we scaled this thing up 30.48 times because of that metric to imperial conversion. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to freeze this transformation to reset this to 0. So that's the button that I added here, which is in Modify, Freeze Transformations, and that should reset that to 1. So now this is true scale. And then I'm going to delete the history of this object. Now, typically in something like that, I mean, we don't need the history of all the operations we did. Something I should have done was made a duplicate of the original. So every time you do major transformations, you always want to make a copy so you leave a trail of steps so that you don't have to like start over if something goes wrong. But in this case, so let's just say I duplicated this guy. There it is, and then the duplicate, I'm going to go ahead and hide this. The duplicate, I would delete the history and make sure that the one that I added is delete by type history. If I did delete all by type, it would delete the history of the entire file. So I'm going to make sure that this is the one you add. So this is only applies to what is selected. So that's the one I used. And then if I go back to my attribute editor, you'll see that basically none of the operations are there. So if I click on this one, you'll see all the different things that I did remain. So that's all the history. So all these things. So now on this one, the history is gone. So hopefully, I don't know if this is going to work exactly, but because if what I'm trying to do is when I export this as OBJ and bring it to Rhino, it'll be the right scale. It might not be. But if it isn't, what we have to do in Rhino is scale down 1 divided by 30.48. But let's just see what this does here. So this is the original one that I exported from Rhino and opened in Maya. See if it worked. Of course not. Okay, so it's big now. So it's 30.48 times the size. So we can just simply add a bounding box. Right, so we can add this bounding box and oops. Remove and snap it there to there. And then scale 3D. But the number would be 1 divided by 30.48. Okay, there it is. So we can see the difference now. Let me get rid of one of these. Let's look at, I think that's the original. Yeah, so this is the new one. So you can see it's nice. It's tightened up a bit, not as lumpy, but there's that funky area that it wouldn't smooth out in my, I don't know what that was, but let's see if I can troubleshoot that. But there's some areas that I missed, it didn't smooth out, but these are relatively flat areas anyway. But so now you've got this new geometry. And so the next step with this guy is we'll look at thickening, the different techniques for thickening this thing. But this should get you going for a while.